Well, welcome. Tonight we're going to talk about areas that nobody really knows. Local barristers, people who provide services with local knowledge, people who do a lot for the town, not just in their professional lives, but who also do a lot in their personal lives to help the town. And at least I'm hoping it's not at the $800 an hour rates that we pay some of the big firms. But everybody, somebody may not know you. Why don't we start with an introduction?
I'm Brian Murray, and I've been a practicing lawyer in Milford since 1985.
And Pacifico DeCapua since 1990, coming up on 29 years.
Wow.
Now, somehow law seems to be in your blood for both of you. I mean, your dad.
Yeah, no, our fathers practiced together. My father, he was admitted to the bar in 1940. His father before him was admitted to the bar in 1910, and I'm still in the same office. And in fact, my own private personal office is the office that his dad used to have when he started in with my father. Yeah. And they had a couple other lawyers. I know there was Victor Piscitello.
Yep, he did the title work.
Yeah, and your dad had the small office that I use now, and I think they had a lot of fun back in those days.
So your fathers worked together.
There's a funny story about that. I was thinking about it on the way here, and I don't even know if you know the story, that my father was, I'm sorry, Al, he was a Boston College student at the time.
That other Jesuit
school in Massachusetts. Yeah. He was in Holliston going to take the LSATs, the exam to get into law school. And he was a witness to a motor vehicle accident. And it held him up, and ultimately, Brian's father, Billy, represented the person who was injured in that accident, and found out that my father was a Milford person and summoned him to take a deposition.
What a great way to get to know each other.
He actually, because at the time, my father had taken the LSATs and gone to law school and was down in Georgetown. Billy paid for him to come back for the deposition, and that's how they began to form a relationship. And after law school, my father went to work with Billy, for him, with him, a little bit of both, while Billy was in the courts as the clerk. My father was there back at the office, kind of handling the overflow that was going on. But that little story that following an accident in Route 16 in Holliston one day led to that relationship.
Wow, I didn't know that. Yeah. I didn't know that. But I mean, I've got still a lot of the old files, and when my father passed, I had to clean out his office and so forth, and came across so many letters, and notes and memos from Pat to my father, and back and forth, and it was a great relationship. And I know my father thought very, very highly of Pat and Skip right up until the day that he passed. He really enjoyed his years with them, and I think they had a lot of fun together.
You sent me a photo when you were cleaning out your mother's house, and there was a photo of my parents. They were out front of your house.
Oh, yes.
And it was April, and that would have made sense. My mother was pregnant at the time, and my mother tells me when I showed her the picture that they were babysitting for you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So it was 1965.
They were dressed very well for babysitters. Back then, it was a different type of world. They were all dressed up.
So now, you grow up in a house where your father's a lawyer, practicing lawyer. What attracted you to go into law?
Well, for myself, I went to Stonehill College, and I majored in political science, and that was, I was really around my sophomore year in college, it started to click in, and what I was interested in, and when it came time to face graduation, I thought about different alternatives and whatever area I wanted to get into. And of course, my father had always told me, you really should consider going to law school. It's something you'll have your entire life. And he was older. He was older when he had me. And he said, I see so many people that work in business, and as they get older, the businesses just discard them. He told me back then like an old typewriter. Now I guess it would be like a computer. He said, but the older I get, the more valuable I get. And that's something that I'll always have. And I always thought of those words. And I think really that's what kind of spurred me to take the next step and go to law school.
I mean, for me, there was never any defining moment where I said, okay, I'm going to be a lawyer. I think back, and I think it was just always understood that that's what I was going to do. It wasn't because anybody told me to do it. It was always just what I felt I would do. And I've thought about this because many people have asked that same question. And there was no epiphany that one day said, I want to be a lawyer. It was just something that I was always expecting I would do. Where I would go, how I would go, those weren't things that I thought about. But seeing what was going on in the 70s and the 80s versus today, there were things that were really appealing that attracted me to pay attention a little bit more. I can remember being, knee-high to my father and trailing around in court, and I followed that all the way through college, where just watching and observing and sitting in on cases and wondering to myself, wow, because it was just so, it's not an assembly line where you're putting the same thing inside of a product and doing and repeating it over and over. And that was the thing that I thought, that I think now, thinking back then, it was an appealing thing to have such a variety of types of things to work on and people to meet with. And that's one thing that I still enjoy today, just the variety.
Now, when we think of, well, first of all, I could never do the law because political science. Well, what was your major?
Political science.
Yeah,
also,
no. I tried that. Once a semester, I would go across to the dark side of campus and try that liberal arts stuff. Could never figure it out. In chemistry, it was simple. A plus B always equals C.
Yeah.
We got over to political science and psychology, and it's like, okay, what's the answer? Well, it depends if B had a bad childhood or if A came from a bad environment. And it's like, okay, but what's the answer?
You know what my father's response to that would be? What do you want the answer?
See, I just could never do it because it's like, tell me the answer. I can figure it out. Two chemicals put together, give me that. It's like the reaction happens this way. I mean, all of a sudden you're going through, everything I've heard about law. I mean, it really does a lot depend on who's representing you.
And I mean, that's a conversation that I have with clients almost every day, and I'm sure Skip does as well. It's difficult for people sometimes to realize that, it's not necessarily definitive. And I tell them, I said, this is not math. It is not 2 + 2 = 4. Law is shades of gray. What I might think is a certain interpretation, Skip might think is a different interpretation. And that's really the art form, to learn as much as you can about an issue and advocate to the way that you feel it ought to go.
Now, what drove you to local law? When I think of, the large firms in Boston, I mean, I got to admit it, everything I've dealt with, I mean, some of them have personalities and the firm feels slightly less frigid, but it seems like a whole different practice, at least to the layman, than when you dealt with, you or Denny Sullivan or, the people that were your neighbors. How did you make the choice between big city and...
I was in law school in D.C., and nearly every one of my classmates were going off into some big city, whether it was New York, Boston, D.C., Philly. They were staying on the East Coast, but for the large part, and getting themselves into a firm working 75 to 80 hours a week and making a ton of money. I didn't want that. I liked being able to put those 70 hours that I think we still can say we do today and do it at my pace.
Yeah, but wait a minute, so you put it into the school committee, the selectmen.
Yeah.
I mean, one way or another, it seems like you still put in your 70 or 80 hours.
True. I think that when you look at a lawyer, there's an old saying that says that the lawyer who doesn't give some sort of public service is sort of a waste of the law degree. There's so much that we learn and understand, and there's so much analysis that we have adapted and been educated upon, that we know how to look at things a little differently, and sometimes another set of eyes is a different and helpful thing. But being able to turn that around and offer that, particularly as many years as Brian has, that's what I think is remarkable for
I think he's calling you old.
Oh, I know. He's right.
Put in a lot of hours.
He's
put in
right.
a lot of time. You really have.
I like your father's piece where I could say I'm valuable. I don't have to say I'm an old man now. I can just say I'm a valuable man.
It's still a pertinent point. I mean, even in today's economy, and back then, I don't think the law was on the books for age discrimination, but it's certainly a factor today. And in the legal profession, you don't necessarily see that.
So Brian, what brought you or kept you in Milford?
Yeah, after I took the bar exam in 1984, I was in Boston. And at that point, there was an open Senate seat. I don't know if you remember, Paul Tsongas had retired, and the Senate seat was open. And there were a number of candidates who were running for it. And I was living in Boston, and I wanted to get involved. And I didn't really know too much about the candidates, but I looked them over, and I thought that John Kerry offered a lot. So I basically just walked into his field office on State Street in Boston. And they put me in as a volunteer, and I just sat down, and the first thing I did was just stuff envelopes. And from there, I was running a nightly polling team. And once he got elected, he won, they had offered me a job. And if they had offered me something in Washington, D.C., I think I would have taken it. But it was in Boston. And at the same time, my dad was on his own, practicing, and he was getting older, and to be honest with you, he was buried. I mean, you'd walk in the office, there was papers all over the place, interrogatories, this and that, and it was really, he was really, he really needed the help. So I wanted to stay there and help him, and one thing just led to another, and I'm still there. But
now,
that was what brought me home.
You're going to go to law school. Now, in medicine, you can be specialized in this or that, but it seems like in law, you also have specialties. How do you choose?
Yeah, I don't say that I have a specialty, but I have a concentration. There's certain areas that I'm doing. Right now, I do real estate, personal injury, bankruptcy, represent small businesses. They have a lot of needs. Some criminal work. I mean, I don't do any family law, divorces, and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, I think for us in our area, I don't know that it's so much specialties, but I think it's kind of a concentration. And with the community, you've got to be malleable. You've got to be able to go into different areas. But it's a fine line. You don't want to be walking into areas that you don't feel qualified in.
I mean, when you go to law school, you don't spend time like you might in medical school with becoming a specialist. You go to law school to learn the law, to learn how to analyze the law, and ultimately to pass the bar exam. And where you go after that is really going to depend on what you're exposed to. If you're exposed to and you're going to go work in education at some state entity and work in Boston, government focused, that's where you're going to probably come out doing more like that. I mean, education law is such a small, and I'm using that as an example, it's such a small specialty. But what
is education law?
Well, anybody who might challenge things that go on with education. There are lawyers who represent clients who, mostly students or parents, who have issues with the school, and
So it'd be like special needs kids trying.
something like that. Yeah.
Special needs is a big area, sure. Yeah.
But I mean, so I think Brian would say the same. We call ourselves general practice attorneys because of the variety of things that we do. if you were to become specialized, it's probably because you did something someplace right out of law school in a firm and you were trained to do that. And you generally just, it narrows your focus when you do those things. And ours started out broad and maybe got a little bit refined. I know neither of us do family law and divorces. It's probably because we saw our fathers do it, frankly. And the things that we do, there's a lot of overlap in the kinds of work that we do. It's probably because it's where we see ourselves most comfortable and most challenging. I mean, I know that it may not happen as often as it once did for me, but sitting in front of a jury and arguing a case, that's to me the most exciting thing that I ever could do, because it really felt to me like that was what I imagined being a lawyer would be. It just doesn't always happen.
Now, if I'm treading over the line, feel free to share, but if you're doing divorces, you're in a small town.
Yeah.
So you're going to know mom and dad. How hard is, I mean, if I know both of them, do I pick one, or do I just, whoever comes to me first? Because I'm probably not going to make friends with the other side after I represent one of them.
Yeah, it's a tough area, and it's never one that I felt particularly comfortable in. And that's a big issue that you talk about, particularly, like you say, in a small town, a small community. So, I mean, I think different lawyers would handle it differently. Some may say, okay, you came to me first, and, I can't deal with the wife. Some might say, something, I know both of you, and it's really not something I want to get involved in. But, as long as they're within ethical bounds, they can do it. But, that was probably one of the factors that I kind of thought about, beyond the fact that it's a very unpleasant area of the law,
There's no one happy.
Yeah, so.
Well, I mean, it's amazing because you've seen people that just, stun me. That they've been together 20, 30 years and all of a sudden, bang.
Well, I know.
And it seems like they become mortal enemies.
Well, it accelerates, and these battles over things that probably aren't significant, and it's just not an area that I, chose to get involved in.
I mean, seeing some of the cases that our fathers might have worked on in the 70s before they had what's called no-fault divorce, when you actually had to prove a reason. You had to prove that someone had done something wrong. Talk about being contentious. Those were some
Yeah, but that'd be
bad
easy
times.
for at least my wife to prove. It'd be simple. I mean, you're out every night doing something. You're involved in all these things.
Yeah.
Not enough.
Not enough?
No. Today it is, yes, but back then, no.
Well, it seems like you can't win that game, because I'm going to find out that you represented Skip and I like his wife, so now I don't like you.
Yeah.
Oh, that happens.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Sure. Yeah, it's
Absolutely.
a tough area.
And that lingers. There are people who still, I think, feel as though look at me differently because of the side I might have been on. I did some, probably for about 2 or 3 years.
How could you represent him or her?
And think that I chose a side.
Well, the toughest part is, you always hear one side of the story.
Yeah.
If you're good friends with the husband, well, she's going to be all sorts of bad things. If you're good friends with her, he's an ogre. But I guess I always try and take it with a grain of salt, because I'm never going to hear both sides. Not that I want to anyway.
Yeah.
Is it worth it to put up with all that? I mean, financially,
You're asking two of the wrong guys. You got to get
well,
a
I
couple
mean, obviously,
you got to get a couple of family practitioners in here to ask them that.
I can tell you that for an attorney who enjoys doing that kind of work, and in the right situation, that legal bill is very expensive. Because every moment that you spend on a case is billable time. And then if you try to do the right thing and not spend every single or count every single second, then it looks the opposite, that you're not spending enough time. So there's a tough balance.
You didn't put your heart and soul in
Right.
it because you didn't charge me enough.
Correct. And yet, to see some of the, and I have seen them, to see some of the invoices, even in the middle of a case for some of the bigger firms, and the kind you hear on the radio all day long, it's not.
Oh,
Yeah.
the do we fleece them and how, or whatever that. I mean, have you sneezed? Well, call us and we will come up with some kind of indication.
Yeah.
But they must be making money.
Those bigger firms make money because they have affiliates who pay a fee to them.
Now, help me.
So you're not going to that firm, you're going to an affiliate of that firm. So when you're looking at the kind of advertising that you see in the middle of the day where someone's at home sick on the couch or with their back after a surgery on the couch and they see something pop up, you're not going to call that person and you're not going to call that office and you're not even going to get a person that you think you know. It's going to be redirected so many different ways.
Well, they said they had 800 lawyers or
Right,
something. I'm
right.
like,
It's really a brokerage situation. It really isn't the practice of law.
No,
They're brokers and they shoot it out and they get a kickback percentage on any case that they send out. And they have nothing to do with the case in any way, shape, or form.
they're just like lead finders.
Yep.
Uh-huh.
Yep, they're really brokers.
Now, you decide you're going to go into law in a small town. I know here in Milford, we've seen in the medical field, because of the electronic records and all the overhead, that I think Uncle Phil Ceramacoli employs 90% of the primary care physicians.
Mm-hmm.
And when they come on, they tell me point blank, we just can't deal with the overhead. How is it for a small law firm?
It's tough. I mean, I think both of us are in sort of unique positions in that we own our buildings, which I think is huge. I'm fortunate enough to be able to have some tenants in my building, so that clearly helps out. But yeah, I mean, you've got to pay the bills, and you're always looking to trim because beyond the fact of being attorneys, we're small business people. We're running small businesses. That's what we're doing. So anywhere you can trim costs, you're looking to do that.
But like, it's the electronic medical records really helps patients, because I can go to any physician and they log into the Milford regional system and all my medication, everything, my history pops up. So now that's become a given. You have to have it. Is there anything like that in the law area?
Well, only with the dockets. I mean, I see in the probate court, but you don't really get any information. You get like, you can get an electronic read on cases in court, but generally it's just like a table of contents, and you don't get to see the actual documents. But legal files are obviously different than the medical files in the sense that our files are personal and pertain to a particular issue.
You always hear attorney-client privilege. Is that like HIPAA, where you have to protect?
It's not like HIPAA because it's communication between a client. So different than confidentiality. Attorney-client privilege is the things that you talk about. Confidentiality is more like HIPAA, not disclosing the fact that I've got John Smith on a case that he was arrested for an OUI last December. That wouldn't be something I could talk about. But having a conversation with John Smith about what he said he drank, that's attorney-client privilege, and has a whole different concept and meaning behind that.
But you still have to protect that as if it was confidential, correct? Or
Yes,
no?
but like the confidentiality records, the confidentiality law applies to us. We might do closings and someone applied for a mortgage, and on their mortgage application they put their date of birth and their social security number. We have an obligation to keep that private and secure. And so those laws that apply for confidentiality apply to us because we do hold a lot of sensitive information.
Now, what happens if I put in on my application something that you find is blatantly, let's say I'm being economical with the truth? What happens? What can you do?
Well, the application actually goes to the lender, so I assume in that scenario would probably be representing the lender.
Okay.
So the other problem that you might have with that is how are we going to know if it's true or not?
Correct.
But I think if there's something that causes a red flag, you know, you might call the lender and say, hey, did you check out line number 10? Does that look okay for you?
If you're
Or something like that.
representing the lender.
If you're representing the lender, which 9 times out of 10, or 10 times out of 10 really, if you're closing that, you're representing the lender,
Okay.
not the client.
So I always wondered.
And that's part of the disclosure process, that the fact that they realize that the attorney's actually representing the lender and not themselves.
But a close analogy to the original question, and this is an age-old question, how do you represent a client that you know if he did it criminally? It's a common question, and it was one that I struggled with from day one. How do you know? And how do you do it? And so the answer to that is, and so if you make that same analogy to lying on a loan application, if you think he did it, then get a new job. Because we as lawyers have an ethical duty to represent a client zealously, and more importantly, not to judge. We're not the judge, we're not the jury. We don't decide. Now, if that client were going to say something which you knew to be false, then you could not disclose that false, but you just have to back away from the case altogether. But trying to decide whether or not to take a case because of whether or not you think they did it or didn't do it is not, get another job, because that's not.
But, okay, let's say you're in a fortunate enough position that you can feed your kids, you know, you can pay your mortgage, so you don't have to take a case. And then you run into Zayarev, or whatever the guy's name was, and somebody who, there's no doubt this is a bad person, and all the evidence said, he did it. How do you get somebody to take that case?
You talking about the marathon bomber?
Yeah.
Personally, I couldn't represent someone like that. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't take the case personally.
But doesn't somebody, I mean.
So there are public defenders, and that's what he had, was a public defender. And if you've chosen to do that kind of work, you don't have the flexibility that we do to say we don't want to take it.
So if you're starting out and you sign up, and I keep reading that they don't pay the public defenders very much.
No.
Or the prosecutors.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
So I sign up as a public defender. Why? If it's not the money, is it to get experience?
Well, you get
or?
a tremendous amount of exposure and experience. You know, and if it's a public defender, a criminal, they'll cover the felonies. So you'll be up in Superior Court. You'll be, you know, maybe a young kid out of law school. You'll be trying a murder case. You know, that's, you know, you can't get that anywhere else. So you'll see a lot of them kind of use that as the training grounds and then go off. But then there are also some that stay
They're
with
lifers, yeah.
Yeah, they stay with his careers, you know, very, very driven, you know, really morally committed to the legal principle that Skip mentioned, and they'll stay there for a long time.
Well, I mean,
But you get a tremendous amount of experience and exposure.
the principle says if our system's going to work, everybody has to have a proper defense.
That's in our Constitution.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, if the system's going to work, I mean, you know, we had the discussion about the skinheads, and it makes me sick that I have to defend them. But that pesky First Amendment says they have the right to be stupid. I mean, I can deplore everything they stand for,
Right.
but
I mean, you know, can you imagine Brian or I defending someone who was publicly embarrassing to himself or the community, and then we standing beside him while he's being arraigned as a choice that we've made? And that's when Brian said, you know, he wouldn't represent the marathon bomber. I think we have the flexibility of being small town attorneys and local attorneys to be able to say which cases we would choose to take. And sometimes it's an easy choice, sometimes it's not.
And a lot of times in these cases, you know, at least in our context on the criminal end, you know, they could arise out of alcohol or substance abuse. And I mean, the way I've approached those, because you're not only representing, you know, the defendant, but, you know, 9 times out of 10 families involved, whether there's a spouse or parents or children or whatever. And, you know, you try to work with the defendant to tell him or her what reality is and what they may need, and you work with the prosecution and you fashion a program going forward that's going to try to benefit the person. Doesn't have to always be black or white. It doesn't have to be, we're going full trial for not guilty, or we're going to toss up our hands and just throw ourselves in the mercy of the court. You try to work with the probation department and the DA to fashion a program to see what makes sense, to try to help the person and help the family.
Do they listen?
Some do, yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, that's another thing about our job and working in a local community. You really get involved with the clients and their family. You know their problems, you know what they have anxiety about, and you really are in a position to try to help them. That doesn't happen, I don't think, so much in a big office. And generally on the criminal cases, and I'll tell the people right away. I said, look, I don't see this as a jury trial. You're going to lose. You've got to realize you've got a problem. You've got to come to grips with that problem, and we can provide you help and guidance along the way and do it that way. That's not for everybody, and some say, well, thank you very much. I'm going to go see somebody else, and that's fine. But I mean, that's the way I have approached those criminal cases over the years, and lots of times you do make a difference with people.
Now, I need a lawyer for something. How do I pick? I mean, hopefully don't go to I can't say Yellow Pages, I'm dating myself.
Yellow Pages.
That's the first thing not to do.
Yeah.
That's the first answer.
But I mean, I go and I Google local attorneys.
That's the second answer.
Right? I mean, how do I pick the attorney that I want to represent me?
I think you need to ask your friends, your neighbors, your family, who they've experienced and what the results of that have been, and that's going to narrow your decision. There might be, setting aside the unique situation where it might be something that no one around locally covers. You have to ask. The ones who advertise whether it's in the Yellow Pages, may be ultimately your best choice, but that shouldn't be the first place you look. That can be a factor. Advertising is unfortunately a piece of this game.
But then it comes down to the great equalizer, the soccer sidelines.
Absolutely.
Just looking around saying, I've got this, who do you know?
Yep.
And then you got to meet with the attorney. It's like anything. You have to feel comfortable with the person, the relationship. Depending on what the problem is, and see if you feel comfortable, if you have a shared insight, shared thought, and go forward that way.
So personality is going to play in.
Yeah, and experience. You need to make sure that they've been in that situation before.
My cousin Vinny.
Yeah.
Going for a murder trial, and I'm going to learn.
No.
Cousin Vinny did well in that movie.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, well, but I think it was rigged. I don't know that I'd want to bet.
Of cause attraction.
Yeah. I don't think I'd want to bet on somebody who's just learning.
No.
So, as we talk, I'm going to find out if I relate to you, if I feel good about you representing
It's
me.
an interview. Yeah.
But what are the 3 basic questions I should ask?
For people have asked me, have you ever done this before?
Yeah, that's number
Do you know
one.
what I mean? Have you had these kind of cases before? And obviously, I mean, like Skip says, experience is a big factor. But I really think it's for the client to try to get as much information as possible and see if they feel comfortable with the attorney. In terms of dedication to the particular matter, how the billing is going to happen. Different cases have different types of financial situations. But really, I think it's seeing eye to eye with the attorney and feeling comfortable going forward with that person on an issue that's very important to
So
them.
personality, experience.
So I'm just going to factor in one more thing. You may find that people like to think that going into the city to a firm, whether it's Framingham, Worcester, Boston, is going to get you something different. And
We'll get you a higher billing rate.
well, that's my point. And we all tie our shoes the same way. And if you feel as though that's where you want to go, then no one should stop you from looking into that. But you get phone calls at night on the weekend, you get emails at night on the weekend. That's the difference. And I'm not trying to sell you or on what you're looking for, but knowing that you can drive over to Brian's office or pick up the phone and call him and reach him if he's not in Boston, and or meet with him over the weekend. And those are the kinds of things that I think are balancing factors as to whether or not you think the guy that tries 30 OUIs a month, okay, so 20 OUIs a month, and is just filled with clients because he's successful. And there are lawyers like that just strictly do drunk driving cases up in certain courts and courthouses, and you might find that there's 2 or 3 like that, and they do a great job. And if that's what you are looking for, then you should look at that. But know that it's going to cost a little bit differently.
It seemed like the law firms that were in New York City ran 800 to 1,000 an hour. Yeah. Boston seemed to be 600. Are they 40% better? Do all the best lawyers gravitate to New York City?
Let me tell you, I had a situation where I represented a woman who was in a car accident, and we were going forward with the insurance company, and she wasn't happy. She thought that it was worth a lot more. So she left. She went to an office in Boston, one of the big names. So comes to find out, all he did was take it in and dish it off to a kid who got out of law school in 2011, okay? So I just, checked on it. Well, that kid left the office, and now someone who got out of law school in 2014 is handling the case. So, you're not going to get this tremendous, I shouldn't say you're not going to, but oftentimes it's quite different as to what's represented and what actually comes down to what happens when you deal with these larger offices.
Well, like you watch TV and you hear, "Call me if you've been wrong." Mm-hmm. And then the part that flipped me is we have 800 lawyers on staff. I'm like, my God, I never heard of a firm with 800 partners.
Yeah, maybe they exist, but like Skip was saying, it's really a brokerage. So they'll just fan it out to, where do you live? So, yes, we have an attorney in that area, and contact him or her.
So they're just selling extra capacity. The attorney in neighboring town will just take a case and pay them a percentage.
Exactly.
But there are even those who aren't like that, and with that brokerage, and just the attorneys that are in the city that just do a lot of work, and you hear their names come up very often. Sometimes you might watch on TV and someone is charged with a crime, and this particular attorney is representing him, and there are some that are more popular in Boston that you might see on the evening news, and you'll always see those names pop up. Well, you're not going to get that lawyer. If you got a simple case, you're not going to get that lawyer. I can tell you that. You might get someone in his firm, and you'll pay for it, and the result, I can pretty much tell you, isn't going to be any different. And so, but there are people who just would feel that that's the direction they want to go, and I wouldn't behoove any of them.
I worked for a CEO that unless you were Princeton, Harvard, or Yale, she was not going to accept, which really flipped me because, for the biotech side, Joe Volman, the fellow that I knew, was superb. He knew our industry cold, and you could talk to him.
Yeah, sure.
You felt he was only billing at $400 an hour, but it's still you're paying a lot more than you would outside. It always struck me. Now you mentioned.
So you just talked about some of the factors about choosing a lawyer. You were very pleased with his experience and also his temperament and personality. Those are,
and his knowledge.
Those are the things that should lead you to one lawyer or another.
So now you mentioned that different cases are structured differently. Are there people who like jury trials and people who don't? How does that work?
Well, statistically, the most jury trials in our system, in the district court system, are OUIs, operating under the influence, statistically. I think it's less than 3% of civil trials, the personal injury when you hurt your back or your neck in an accident, less than 3% actually go to trial.
Because they settle, or?
Because they settle. There's a big incentive, and it takes so long to get through the system, and you can be all set and ready for trial, and only to find out that they're not going to reach you that day, and it just goes on and on and on, and the incentives to settle civil cases are actually written within our rules implicitly, because it's encouraged that both sides share information through what's called discovery. The intent of that is to get people to settle, because there isn't enough time in the day, or courts or judges, to hear every case.
Yeah, basically the areas of the law. Generally, personal injury is handled on a contingent basis. So that means that you would not, if you got in a car accident, as Skip said, you wouldn't have to pay a lawyer to take that case, and the attorney would get paid based upon a percentage of the eventual recovery. Now that percentage can vary, and some of the larger offices could charge upwards of 35, 40, sometimes even 50%. So percentages could go as low as 20 or 25%. So that's an area of discussion that you can have with the attorney. Generally, it's a third, but it does change. There's the billable hour concept, which applies, I think, from what, like you were talking about, business law, representing businesses. Civil litigation oftentimes is handled billable hours. Family law, divorce, that kind of thing. So that's where the attorney's hourly rate comes into play. And also, folks should be finding out what is covered and what's not covered. Am I going to be paying for all of the paper clips you use? Am I going to be paying for all the copies you make? What about travel costs? So on an hourly arrangement, it's also important for the person to understand what other costs are included or are not included.
Yeah, I remember when we were doing the high school, and I was on that building committee, and I started seeing that we were couriering documents everywhere. And then I looked at the contract where the architect got 15% above cost. And I said, wait a minute, if I mail this out, it's $5. If I courier it, it's 15. So in one case, you're getting 75 cents for every one you send. In another case, do the math, you're getting $7.50. So it seems strange that...
But that was on an architect, not an attorney.
No, but it was the same idea where you're saying, do I pay for every copy you make?
Right.
Well...
And that's a discussion you need to have with the attorney before you hire. Okay, if we're going to do this on an hourly basis, what is your hourly rate? What other costs could I, look to be responsible for?
So you can ask that. I can go in and say, Skip,
Sure.
you're charging me whatever dollars an hour.
I mean,
What else? What are the additional charges that I'm going to face?
You have your cases that are flat fees, because we anticipate that we know what kind of work is going to be involved, and we anticipate how many hours we would spend, and we anticipate what the rest of the legal community might charge on a case like that. So then there are their flat fees, or a range
Like?
for like a criminal defense, a simple misdemeanor in the district court. You might find that there's different tiering if it went to trial, if it didn't go to trial. Flat fees that are openly discussed, and we're required to disclose those. We're required to put it in writing, to put the estimate in writing, to have the client agree to it. So it's not going to be a surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise. The only time it's a surprise is if it's not disclosed to you, and that's probably not the lawyer that you want to have. Everything, if among the first conversations you have with that attorney is the cost and what it's going to be, that's a good starting point, because they're telling you that they're open and honest with you, and they're trying to anticipate what the range or what the cost would be and the type of billing that there might be.
How is it determined whether it's a jury trial or not?
Well, it's the choice of the defendant. The defendant can always choose. Are we talking about criminal or civil? Or?
Well, either one. Let's start with...
Okay, well, if you want to start with criminal, it's the choice of the defendant whether or not to go forward with a jury trial, or could have a bench trial, or could plea out. And generally, I guess by rule of thumb, if you have a legal issue or a legal question, you'd probably want to go bench trial in front of a judge. And if it's a question of fact, generally you'd want to be in front of a jury.
So now you mentioned that driving under the influence is a large percentage.
Yeah.
Jury.
Just if you sit up in front of the Worcester, because that's where the jury session for Milford Court would take you, you would see that most of the cases that are in front of the jury are operating under the influence charge.
Is that because you're hoping that they'll take pity on you?
No, no.
Why would I want a jury trial versus a judge?
So there's a lot of factors that go into that, and one might be the judge himself or herself. And some judges are very clearly have a lower threshold for what we call reasonable doubt. Some have a higher threshold for reasonable doubt. And it's not because they come out and they're a liberal or a conservative. It's just we know their tendencies. We know, having been in front of them before, what they might be thinking of. There are some judges that may have certain buttons that you don't want to push. And so knowing the judges and knowing who they are is a large factor into that decision, which may come at a moment when the client needs to make that decision and not really have much time to make that decision. Do I want a judge or do I want a jury?
But you don't get to pick your judge, right?
No, no.
Is it like a pool that...
It's random.
Depends on what session you're in, and where your what the calendar is. I mean, if you have something in Milford Court, chances are it could be Judge Calagione, but there are times when Judge Calagione's not there, and it would be another judge. And if your case comes up that day, you have to deal with the other judge.
You don't get to just say, well, I want March 14th because I know that this judge is going to be there that day. You can't do that.
I'd rather wait for Judge Calagione.
No.
No, huh?
No. Oh, we'd like to do that. I mean, no, on certain, we can say that to ourselves, but it's not something that we get to choose.
It's not a reason for.
Right.
It's not a valid reason to continue
but
something.
on a jury, I got 12 people?
So the reasonable doubt standard is a difficult thing to even define. And it's sometimes a challenge for a jury to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, and it's to our benefit as defense attorneys to give that benefit to the defendant if they have questions that might involve reasonable doubt.
And generally for the misdemeanors, for the OUIs, your jury's 6 persons, so the prosecution has to convince all 6 beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant in fact committed.
So 5-1, the defense wins?
No, 6-0 either way. Any other thing is a misdemeanor. I'm sorry, a mistrial.
Okay, but that's what I'm saying. If I convince 5 out of 6, okay, I got to start again?
Yeah, you theoretically, but it would be a decision that the district attorney's office would make is whether they want to re-prosecute.
Okay. So now, when I look at the lawyer, are there certain lawyers that want jury trials? I mean, they live for that kind of law? Or?
Yeah, there are practitioners that specialize in that basically do primarily trial work. In the old days, back when they had the de novo system, you could, try a case in the Milford Court before Judge Larkin, and if you didn't like the outcome, you could appeal it up to Worcester in front of a jury and get a brand new case. So there was a lot more trials back in those days than when I first got out. But now there are lawyers who specifically handle the criminal cases like Skip referenced, and they'll be in Worcester District all the time.
So then, somebody you hear has been convicted 5 times of driving under the influence. How does an attorney pull number 6 out of the hat?
So number 1 through 5 isn't something that the jury would understand or hear about.
Oh.
Okay?
So you got to try
Could
each
come in
one.
on sentencing. if the-
It comes in if they found the person
Guilty?
guilty,
Yeah.
and then the judge would know about that and perhaps, have that conversation.
So you don't want to prejudice the jury by saying this guy's already, or this gal's been convicted 5 times.
But the same would happen with any prior crime. The jury doesn't know if the person sitting in the defendant's chair has been a saint his or her whole life or not. The jury doesn't know that, and that's the concept of blind justice. They're not something that it's considered. It's not a factor.
You can't somehow get in the fact that I've never been convicted, I've never done this,
Which is why we always make sure they dress appropriately when they go to court. No, it's a big factor. It's a big thing to dress right, to have the appearance that you understand and respect what's going on. Those are the kinds of things that we would want the jury to understand, that the person sitting in that chair is not a terrible person. And then that helps.
And the trial itself, the jury just deals with the specific incidents as alleged, the specific facts as alleged, not really the whole life history about the person. And then if the jury finds the person guilty, then that information would come forward in terms of sentencing.
So the judge gets to see
To
it,
second tier, second
but
level.
if they're found not guilty, they're gone.
The
That's
only
the end
time
of
it
the
would ever
ballgame.
come in is if the defendant, for some strange reason, chose to testify. Once you testify,
Yeah,
you're
that's
subject to
okay.
being impeached. You impeach your credibility with prior crimes. So if someone does have a history of criminal offenses, they can say, Mr. Correa, are you the same Mr. Correa that was convicted in the Milford District Court in 1988 for whatever?
Oh, okay.
Then that.
So there's your first hint. If your lawyer says testify,
Well-
get a new lawyer.
There's very seldom when a defendant would testify for himself or herself. Very seldom. And because there are so many things, particularly on this type of case of an operating under the influence, it's hard to get them to testify in a way that will help them.
So now we're reading about quick DNA systems, where in 90 minutes, the police will be able to run your DNA.
Mm.
Do you see an opening there for defense attorneys, or?
I'm not doing as much criminal as I used to do, so it's not really
Well,
something.
hopefully you're
that,
passing the laws.
Yeah, yeah, we'll work on that. Yeah. But I mean, the technology is always changing. It's always evolving. I mean, right now, the whole issue about the breathalyzers not being brought into evidence because they've, discovered malfunctioning in that process. That's a whole other level in terms of the way OUIs are handled now. So, I mean, I think the legal world sometimes is slow to react, but it always does need to respond and react to the changing technology of the times.
Well, I don't envy the prosecuting attorneys on pot, driving,
Yeah, that's
because, when you think about it, in the last few years, there's been a lot of work studying the genetic makeup of different strains of cannabis and eliminating some of the THC components, because people legitimately that want it for medicinal use don't want to get high. So you take and smoke or eat strains that are very low on THC, and it's
It's a challenge in the court system for what is called driving under the influence of drugs, because there is no test to test what you've been consuming. And then there are no real physical tests like we have field sobriety that are based on some sort of foundation to have a relation or a connection with being under the
Well,
influence.
when I think of cause and relate, okay, if I'm smoking right in front of you, it's legal, and I'm smoking a strain that doesn't make you high, okay.
It's enough
How do I test that?
It's a big question. It's very difficult for the prosecution to prove impaired operation based on marijuana. And that was a big issue with the legalization of marijuana. And the bill that actually got finalized in legislation appointed a commission to study that and come up with appropriate standards and testing methods to try to help out to show impaired operation. And they're working on that now.
I mean, I can see it. You're just a bad driver. You may be sober. You're just a bad driver.
But think about it. You know, you're pulled over for something simple like having a tail light out, or you know, maybe a little more complicated like speeding, and there's an odor in the car. It's not the Cheech and Chong with the smoke coming out the windows, but you know, an odor, and glassy and bloodshot eyes, yet not at all impaired. You're going to be arrested, and it's probably the right thing to do to take that person off the road, and it's going to be really hard to prosecute that person. So we don't have an answer.
For?
Well, we don't have an. So without having the mechanism in place, we are at the beginning of some sort of newfound right. law that none of us, including judges and prosecutors, are really experienced with yet, and trying to figure out what should be the litmus test. What is there one? Can we do it? And ultimately, that's where our jurors come in.
But again, most jurors are going to be political science or sociology majors. They're not going to understand the chemistry. So you start talking to them about, well, this strain has high THC in it, you know, cannabinoid distillates, and okay, you see their eyes gloss over. Because a lot of the scientists don't understand the direct relationship yet.
Yeah.
So how, I mean, when you say to me,
it's a challenge.
Benefit of the doubt, you'd be hard pressed to convince me there's no doubt he was impaired or she was impaired. Unless you can prove they were driving crazy.
I can tell you that if I saw your bio on a juror questionnaire, I wouldn't want you on the jury.
Yeah, they threw me out twice.
Yeah, anybody in the medical field has a certain exposure on that type of case, and that's your reason. I just remember going to Worcester.
Yeah.
I've been called to jury duty twice, and both times they've thrown me out.
That's a good thing.
Yeah. I was going to say, I guess they just don't like scientists.
Yeah. Well, it depends on what you're looking for, you know, in the jury. You know, there are some cases where you would want scientists.
Well, as we wrap up, what last words would you leave? If somebody needs a lawyer, what would you tell them, Brian?
Well, it's like anything, you know, look into it, you know, like, you know, Skip had indicated, you know, talk to people that you trust, your family, friends. You know, see who they may have used as an attorney, find out as much as you can about the attorney, and then sit down and talk to the attorney and say, look, you know, this is the situation I have. How would you handle it? What would you suggest? What would your fees be? What would your costs be? And then I think, you know, go forward with someone that you feel comfortable with. But, you know, I may be biased, but, you know, I do think that there's a great benefit on most cases, not on all, to have a local lawyer as opposed to somebody in a larger city where you can't always reach. And certainly the local type practice is much more accessible.
I mean, I don't want to repeat everything he said because it's 100% right on. I think that when you are asking and speaking with people about who they might have used, it has to be a face that you know. Walking in to meet someone for the first time is a challenge for any client, but walking in because you saw Brian at town meeting, or you saw him, or you voted for him because he was running for re-election, you want to have someone that you know and that you're comfortable communicating with. And there may not be every situation where that's the kind of relationship you want, but it's a factor. You know, how many times you were each of us on the sideline of some sporting event, and you see people. I think the last count was, I was coached for 46 teams over a period of time, and it was just a great experience to be able to be a local attorney who could go out and do those things into the public and to volunteer that kind of time, because ultimately that's who you want to turn around.
And as we wrap up, from The people in Milford, thank you for all the time you've given not billable hours to school committee and all the other functions you've been involved with. And to our 6 loyal viewers, I hope you've gotten a feeling for what's available here in Milford and how to approach local lawyers. And as always, may tomorrow be a better and more pleasant day than today. May God bless. Good night, and thank you for joining.
Not too long since I've been home.